the aircraft carrier Shokaku trembled beneath Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's boots as the first American dive bomber screamed down through the morning haze on June 19, 1944. He had sailed these waters with confidence just hours before, commanding the largest carrier strike force Japan had assembled since Midway 2 years prior. 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and 13 cruisers stretched across the Philippine Sea in a formation that should have overwhelmed any enemy fleet. What Ozawa did not know as he gripped the railing of his flagship's bridge and watched his fighter pilots struggle skyward was that every radio transmission, every course change, every launch order had been intercepted and decoded by American intelligence. The trap had already been set, and 300 miles to the east, Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher's Task Force 58 was preparing to unleash a storm of naval aviation that would annihilate Japan's carrier capability in a single afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The strategic calculation that brought these 2 fleets to the Philippine Sea reflected Japan's increasingly desperate situation in the Pacific. American forces had been advancing westward across the Central Pacific for 18 months, capturing the Gilbert Islands, the Marshalls, and now threatening the Marianas. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam formed a chain of islands that lay just 1,300 miles from Tokyo. If America secured these islands, their new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands with devastating regularity. For Japan's military leadership, the defense of the Marianas represented the final defensive perimeter that could keep American bombers away from Japanese cities. Failure here would mean accepting the inevitability of strategic bombing campaigns that could cripple Japanese industry and morale. Admiral Somu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had staked everything on Operation Ago. The plan was audacious and reflected the kind of all-or-nothing gambling that characterized Japanese naval strategy throughout the war. Ozawa's carriers would launch strikes at maximum range, taking advantage of the lighter fuel loads and longer operational radius of Japanese aircraft. American planes would have to close within striking distance, giving Japanese forces the opportunity to attack first. Land-based aircraft from Guam, Rota, and Yap would coordinate with carrier strikes to overwhelm American defenses. Most critically, Japanese planners believed their pilots retained the skill and fighting spirit that had carried them to victory at Pearl Harbor. This assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seiki stood in the ready room of Carrier Taiho, the newest and largest carrier in the Japanese fleet, reviewing final mission briefings with his squadron of Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber pilots. Seiki had been flying combat missions since the invasion of the Philippines in 1941, and he recognized the tension in the faces of the younger pilots around him. Most had fewer than 6 months of operational training compared to the 2 years of preparation that Seiki's generation had received before the war. Japan's pilot training programs had collapsed under the pressure of constant combat losses and fuel shortages. The replacements arriving at carrier squadrons were brave and dedicated, but they lacked the thousands of hours of flight time that transformed adequate pilots into combat veterans. Seiki understood that his squadron was being asked to achieve results that would require skills these young men simply did not possess. 320 miles to the east, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley stood on the flight deck of USS Lexington watching the controlled chaos of pre-launch operations. Flatley commanded Air Group 16, one of 15 carrier air groups assigned to Task Force 58. His pilots flew Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Each aircraft represented the cutting edge of American aviation technology, equipped with radios that worked reliably, gun sights that were properly calibrated, and engines that had been tested through thousands of hours of operation. More importantly, Flatley's pilots had been training together for 8 months. They understood tactical formations, communication procedures, and attack patterns that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing vulnerability to enemy fire. The contrast between American and Japanese pilot quality had become so pronounced by mid-1944 that American squadron commanders worried more about operational accidents than enemy action. The technological revolution that gave American naval aviation such overwhelming advantages was perhaps most evident in radar systems. Task Force 58 included 15 carriers equipped with SK air search radar capable of detecting incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Fighter direction officers stationed in combat information centers aboard each carrier could vector defending fighters toward enemy formations with precision that Japanese forces could not match. American fighter pilots received continuous radio updates on enemy positions, altitudes, and headings, allowing them to position themselves for optimal intercept angles. Japanese pilots flying toward American carriers had no early warning of defending fighters until visual contact was made, usually at ranges of less than 2 miles where evasive action was nearly impossible. Admiral Mitscher had positioned Task Force 58 in 5 separate carrier groups spread across 40 miles of ocean. Each group centered on 3 or 4 carriers protected by cruisers and destroyers equipped with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns. The formation provided mutual support while minimizing the risk that a single Japanese attack could cripple multiple carriers. Mitscher's chief of staff, Captain Arleigh Burke, had calculated that American defenses could engage incoming raids at ranges of 60 miles with fighter patrols, 30 miles with long-range anti-aircraft fire, and within 10 miles with massed batteries of 5-inch guns and 40mm cannons. Any Japanese aircraft that penetrated these defensive layers would face close-range fire from 20mm guns mounted throughout each carrier's superstructure. The integration of radar detection, radio communication, and layered defenses created a protective envelope that made successful attacks on American carriers extraordinarily difficult. Commander Yoshio Shiga led the first Japanese strike wave launched from carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku at dawn on June 19. 69 aircraft including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes formed up over the Japanese fleet before turning eastward toward the last known position of American carriers. Shiga had flown strikes against American carriers at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, and he understood the formidable defenses his formation would face. What concerned him most was the quality of the pilots following him into combat. Several had become separated during the formation process, unable to maintain proper spacing in cloudy conditions. Radio discipline was poor, with pilots making unnecessary transmissions that revealed their position to American monitoring stations. When Shiga tested his radio compass to verify his heading toward the enemy fleet, the equipment malfunctioned, forcing him to rely on dead-reckoning navigation across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The American radar operators aboard USS Lexington detected Shiga's formation at 1005 hours while the Japanese aircraft were still 75 miles away. Lieutenant Joseph Eggert, the fighter direction officer, immediately scrambled every available Hellcat fighter and began vectoring them toward the incoming raid. 43 fighters from multiple carriers converged on Shiga's formation from 3 different directions, achieving complete tactical surprise. The Japanese pilots, expecting to locate American carriers before encountering fighter opposition, suddenly found themselves under attack by aircraft diving from superior altitude with significant speed advantages. The discipline and training that American pilots had received proved decisive in the furious combat that followed. Lieutenant Alexander Vrashu of Fighter Squadron 16 was leading a 4-plane division when he spotted the Japanese formation below him at 12,000 feet. Vrashu had already claimed 19 confirmed victories, making him one of the Navy's leading aces, and his combat experience allowed him to assess the tactical situation instantly. The Japanese formation was poorly organized with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes intermixed rather than properly separated by altitude and function. Vrashu selected his targets carefully, diving toward a group of 6 dive bombers that had become separated from their fighter escort. His opening burst caught the lead bomber squarely in the engine, and the aircraft exploded in a brilliant flash of orange flame. Vrashu pulled up sharply, reversed his turn, and dove toward a second bomber. His guns fired in short, controlled bursts that conserved ammunition while ensuring hits on vulnerable areas. Within 6 minutes, Vrashu had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, demonstrating the lethal effectiveness that superior training and equipment provided American naval aviators. Commander Shiga watched in horror as his carefully planned strike disintegrated under the relentless attacks of American fighters. Aircraft were falling from the sky in burning spirals, their crews lost before they could contribute anything to the mission. Radio calls for help overwhelmed the frequency as Japanese pilots reported being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Shiga attempted to maintain formation cohesion, but the psychological impact of watching squadron mates die was devastating the morale of surviving pilots. Those who pressed on toward the American carriers would face defenses that were now fully alerted and prepared for their arrival. The attack that was supposed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific was collapsing into a massacre that would cost Japan irreplaceable pilots and aircraft. Aboard carrier Shokaku, Admiral Ozawa received fragmentary reports of the developing air battle with growing alarm. His communications officers were intercepting panicked radio transmissions from the strike force, but the chaotic nature of aerial combat made it impossible to determine what was actually happening. Ozawa knew that American fighters had intercepted his aircraft earlier than expected, suggesting that enemy radar capabilities exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates. What he did not know was that his second and third strike waves were being tracked by American radar even as they formed up over the Japanese fleet. The element of surprise that Japanese planning had depended upon had been completely negated by American technological superiority. The second Japanese strike wave, consisting of 128 aircraft launched from carriers Jinyo, Hayo, and Ryuho, departed at 0856 hours heading toward Task Force 58. Lieutenant Zenji Abe commanded a squadron of torpedo bombers carrying the Type 91 aerial torpedo, a weapon that had proven devastatingly effective against Allied warships earlier in the war. Abe's orders were to coordinate his attack with dive bombers that would strike from high altitude while his torpedo planes approached at wavetop level. The tactic required precise timing and excellent communication between different aircraft types, capabilities that Japanese formations increasingly lacked as experienced pilots were killed and inadequately trained replacements struggled with basic operational procedures. American radar detected the second wave at 70 miles range, and Mitscher immediately launched additional fighters to reinforce the defensive combat air patrol. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Duncan of Fighting Squadron 2 was among the first to intercept the incoming raid. Duncan had been flying combat missions for 4 months, and he had developed an instinctive understanding of aerial tactics that allowed him to exploit Japanese weaknesses. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He observed that the enemy formation was strung out over several miles with dive bombers flying at high altitude while torpedo planes skimmed the wave tops below. The lack of coordination meant that defending fighters could engage each group separately rather than facing a concentrated attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Duncan dove toward the high-altitude dive bombers, firing as he closed to point-blank range. His target, a Yokosuka D-4Y, attempted a sharp turn to evade but lacked the speed to escape. Duncan's 650 caliber machine guns fired 200 rounds in a 3-second burst, and the dive bomber's wings separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled into the sea, taking its crew with it. Duncan pulled up, scanned for additional targets, and dove toward another group of bombers attempting to penetrate the American defensive screen. The systematic destruction of Japanese aircraft continued with mechanical efficiency as American pilots exploited every advantage their superior training and equipment provided. The human cost of Japan's deteriorating tactical situation became evident as surviving pilots from the first strike wave struggled back toward their carriers. Many aircraft were damaged by American gunfire, their hydraulic systems leaking, engines running rough, and pilots wounded or exhausted from the stress of combat. Some pilots became lost in the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea, their navigation skills inadequate for finding their carriers without functioning radio compasses or reliable weather information. Several aircraft crashed while attempting to land aboard carriers that were maneuvering at high speed to avoid American submarine attacks. The compound losses from combat casualties, operational accidents, and navigation failures created a disaster that exceeded even pessimistic Japanese projections. Lieutenant Commander Seki managed to lead 12 survivors from his original squadron back to carrier Taiho after fighting through American fighters and barely escaping with his life. As he climbed from his cockpit, Seki could see the exhaustion and trauma on the faces of his fellow pilots. These men had witnessed the systematic destruction of their comrades by an enemy whose technological and tactical superiority seemed insurmountable. Seiki reported to his squadron commander that American defenses had proven far more formidable than intelligence estimates suggested. Fighter opposition had been encountered at extreme range with enemy pilots demonstrating skill levels that Japanese formations could not match. More critically, many of Japan's youngest pilots had panicked under fire, breaking formation and attempting individual evasive maneuvers that made them easy targets for coordinated American attacks. The third Japanese strike wave launched at 1,000 hours consisted of 47 aircraft from carriers Shokaku, Chitose, and Chiyoda. By this time, American radar operators had become so proficient at tracking incoming raids that they could estimate the composition and altitude of enemy formations before visual contact was made. Fighter direction officers vectored defending Hellcats toward optimal intercept positions with precision that reflected months of practice and refinement. The Japanese pilots flying toward Task Force 58 were essentially flying into a killing zone where every advantage favored the defenders. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb of Fighting Squadron 10 was among the American pilots scrambled to intercept the third wave. Webb had earned his nickname because of his ability to weave through enemy formations, attacking from unexpected angles before escaping at high speed. His tactics reflected the confidence that American pilots had developed after months of one-sided combat against increasingly overmatched Japanese opponents. Webb positioned his division above and behind the Japanese formation, allowing his pilots to dive through the enemy aircraft with speed advantages that made counterattacks nearly impossible. The Hellcat's robust construction allowed it to absorb damage that would have destroyed lighter Japanese fighters, giving American pilots additional advantages in sustained combat. Webb's attack shredded the Japanese formation within minutes. His wingman, Ensign Richard Stambuk, followed him through the diving pass and claimed 2 bombers before pulling up to engage fighters attempting to protect the battered strike force. The coordination between American pilots reflected hundreds of hours of training that emphasized mutual support and disciplined communication. Japanese pilots, many of whom were flying their first combat mission, found themselves overwhelmed by opponents who anticipated their moves and exploited every tactical mistake with lethal precision. The technological gap between American and Japanese naval aviation extended beyond aircraft performance to include weapons systems that gave American forces decisive advantages. The Mark II gun sight installed in Hellcat fighters automatically calculated the deflection angle needed to hit maneuvering targets, allowing pilots to achieve kill rates that would have been impossible with manual aiming. Japanese fighters still relied on optical ring sights that required pilots to estimate deflection based on experience and intuition. American .50 caliber machine guns fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds that could penetrate Japanese aircraft from extreme range, while Japanese weapons lacked the hitting power to consistently damage the robust construction of American fighters and bombers. Aboard USS Enterprise, Commander David McCampbell prepared to launch with his fighter squadron as reports of the third Japanese strike wave came through on the radio. McCampbell, who would eventually become the Navy's all-time leading ace with 34 confirmed victories, had been studying Japanese tactics for months. He recognized that enemy formations had become progressively less organized as the quality of Japanese pilot training declined. The rigid formations that Japanese squadrons had employed early in the war had given way to loose groups of aircraft that lacked tactical cohesion. McCampbell planned to exploit this weakness by directing his pilots to focus on the most vulnerable elements of each formation, typically the inexperienced pilots flying on the flanks who could be separated and destroyed without interference from more capable squadron leaders. The systematic destruction of Japanese strike aircraft continued throughout the morning as wave after wave of attackers encountered American defenses that seemed impenetrable. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike wave, only 27 returned to their carriers. The second wave lost 98 aircraft out of 128 launched. The third wave suffered losses of 37 aircraft from the original 47. The carnage was so one-sided that American pilots began referring to the engagement as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a nickname that captured both the lopsided nature of the combat and the almost casual ease with which experienced American pilots destroyed their opponents. Admiral Ozawa, watching the disaster unfold from Taiho's bridge, faced a command decision that would determine the fate of Japan's remaining carrier forces. He could continue launching strikes against American carriers in hopes that accumulated damage would eventually cripple Task Force 58, or he could preserve his remaining aircraft and withdraw westward beyond the range of American counterattacks. The traditional aggressive spirit of Japanese naval doctrine demanded that he press the attack regardless of losses, but the practical reality was that his carrier air groups had been effectively destroyed as combat-effective units. The pilots returning to his carriers were traumatized and exhausted, many reporting that American defenses were so formidable that successful attacks seemed impossible. The crisis aboard Taiho intensified dramatically at 0932 hours when torpedoes fired by American submarine USS Albacore struck the carrier on her starboard side. Commander James Blanchard had been tracking the Japanese fleet for 6 hours, patiently maneuvering his boat into attack position. The submarine's radar had detected the carriers at dawn, and Blanchard had closed to within 3,000 yards before firing a spread of 6 torpedoes toward the largest target he could identify. One torpedo found its mark, striking Taiho just forward of the island superstructure. The initial damage seemed manageable with the carrier maintaining speed and continuing flight operations, but ruptured aviation fuel lines were spreading volatile fumes throughout the ship's interior spaces. Within hours, these fumes would trigger an explosion that would doom Japan's newest and most capable aircraft carrier. Lieutenant Commander Seiki was preparing for a second strike mission when the torpedo hit Taiho. The explosion threw him against a bulkhead, stunning him momentarily. As he regained his bearings, Seiki could smell the distinctive odor of aviation gasoline mixed with the acrid smoke from damaged electrical systems. Damage control parties were already responding to the crisis, but the complexity of modern aircraft carriers made assessing the full extent of damage difficult. Seiki and his fellow pilots were ordered to remain in their ready room while engineering officers determined whether the carrier could continue operating aircraft safely. The uncertainty created a psychological burden that added to the stress these men had already experienced during the morning's disastrous air battles. 300 miles to the east, Admiral Mitscher was receiving reports from his fighter pilots that confirmed Japanese strikes had been completely defeated. Fewer than 20 enemy aircraft had penetrated close enough to American carriers to attempt attacks, and these had been driven off by intense anti-aircraft fire without scoring any hits. American losses totaled 16 aircraft, most of which had been shot down by concentrated Japanese defensive fire rather than in air-to-air combat. The disparity in casualties reflected the fundamental transformation of naval aviation that had occurred over the previous 2 years. American training programs, technological advantages, and tactical doctrine had created a qualitative superiority that Japanese forces could not overcome regardless of the courage and determination their pilots demonstrated. Commander Richard Harmer, Air Operations Officer aboard USS Bunker Hill, was coordinating the recovery of American fighters returning from defensive patrols when he received orders to prepare a strike against the Japanese fleet. Reconnaissance aircraft had located Ozawa's carriers approximately 300 miles to the west, beyond the normal range of American carrier aircraft but potentially vulnerable to a maximum range strike launched in late afternoon. The tactical calculation was complex and risky. American aircraft would need to attack at extreme range, leaving minimal fuel reserves for the return flight. Many pilots would be forced to land after dark, a dangerous procedure even under ideal conditions. Losses from fuel exhaustion and crash landings might exceed combat casualties. But the opportunity to destroy Japanese carrier forces in a single devastating blow was too valuable to ignore. Mitscher's decision to launch the late afternoon strike reflected the aggressive tactical philosophy that characterized American naval operations by mid-1944. Earlier in the war, carrier commanders had been cautious about exposing their forces to counterattack, preferring to maintain defensive formations that minimized risk. The systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation throughout 1943 and early 1944 had given American commanders confidence that they could operate with minimal threat from enemy airstrikes. This confidence, built on repeated victories and growing technological superiority, allowed Mitscher to authorize operations that would have been considered unacceptably risky 2 years earlier. At 1,621 hours, 216 aircraft launched from 11 carriers of Task Force 58 for what would become one of the longest-range carrier strikes of the Pacific War. The formation included 85 Hellcat fighters, 77 Helldiver dive bombers, and 54 Avenger torpedo bombers. Lieutenant Commander Robert Isley led the strike coordination, flying from USS Belleau Wood. Isley had been briefed on the location of Japanese carriers based on the most recent reconnaissance reports, but he understood that the enemy fleet would have moved significantly during the 2 hours required for American aircraft to reach the target area. Locating the Japanese carriers in the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea would require skill, experience, and considerable luck. The flight westward toward the Japanese fleet took American aircraft over empty ocean where navigation errors could prove fatal. Pilots monitored their fuel consumption carefully, calculating the point at which they would be committed to the strike regardless of whether targets were found. The psychological pressure of flying beyond safe return range created tension that even experienced aviators found difficult to ignore. Several pilots experienced radio failures that left them isolated from formation leaders and forced to navigate independently using compass headings and elapsed time calculations. The operational complexity of coordinating over 200 aircraft across 300 miles of ocean demonstrated the sophisticated planning and execution capabilities that American naval aviation had developed. Aboard carrier Shokaku, Commander Shiga was debriefing pilots from the morning strikes when urgent reports came through that American reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted circling the Japanese fleet. Shiga immediately understood the implications. American carriers would launch strikes based on these sighting reports, and the depleted Japanese combat air patrol would be unable to provide effective defense against a major attack. Most of Japan's available fighters had been lost during the morning engagements, and surviving pilots were exhausted from hours of continuous combat operations. The carriers themselves were vulnerable, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for missions that would now never be launched. At 1840 hours, Lieutenant Junior Grade George Brown spotted the Japanese fleet through broken clouds. Brown, flying an Avenger torpedo bomber from USS Enterprise, had been searching the ocean surface for 30 minutes when he noticed the distinctive wakes of multiple ships maneuvering at high speed. He immediately radioed his sighting report to the strike coordinator, providing heading, speed, and composition of the enemy force. Brown counted 3 large carriers, 2 smaller carriers, numerous cruisers and destroyers, and several oilers that were attempting to separate from the main formation. The Japanese fleet was spread across 20 miles of ocean, presenting multiple targets but also complicating the coordination of American attacks. Commander James Ramage, leading Bombing Squadron 10 from USS Enterprise, selected carrier Hayo as his primary target. The carrier was maneuvering radically to evade the incoming strike, turning at maximum rudder while launching every available fighter to defend against the American attack. Ramage positioned his dive bombers in a line astern formation, each aircraft preparing for the steep diving attack that would bring them through intense anti-aircraft fire before releasing their 1,000-pound bombs. The approach required courage that bordered on recklessness as Japanese gunners filled the sky with explosive shells designed to shred attacking aircraft. Ramage rolled his Helldiver into its dive at 12,000 feet, pushing the aircraft past vertical until the carrier's flight deck filled his bomb sight. The acceleration pressed him into his seat as the dive bomber screamed downward at speeds exceeding 300 knots. Anti-aircraft shells exploded around his aircraft, their black bursts creating a deadly obstacle course through which he had to fly. Ramage held his dive angle steady, making only slight adjustments to track the carrier's evasive turns. At 2,000 feet, he released his bomb and pulled up sharply, the G-forces graying his vision momentarily. Behind him, other dive bombers followed in precise sequence, their bombs falling toward Hayo in a pattern that reflected months of training and combat experience. The first bomb struck Hayo's flight deck near the island superstructure, penetrating through to the hangar deck below where fueled and armed aircraft were staged for launch. The explosion triggered secondary fires that quickly spread through the confined spaces of the hangar. Additional bombs hit forward and aft, opening holes in the flight deck that made aircraft operations impossible. Within minutes, Hayo was wreathed in flames and black smoke, her crew fighting desperately to contain fires that threatened the ship's magazines and fuel storage areas. The carrier began losing speed as damage to her propulsion systems accumulated, making her an increasingly vulnerable target for follow-on attacks. Lieutenant Commander William Martin led his torpedo squadron from USS Hornet toward carrier Shokaku, Japan's last surviving veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack force. Martin had been flying combat missions since the Guadalcanal campaign, and he understood that torpedo attacks required split-second timing and absolute courage. His Avenger torpedo bombers approached Shokaku at wave-top altitude, flying directly into the concentrated fire of the carrier's escorts. Japanese destroyers threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire that destroyed 2 Avengers before they could launch their torpedoes. Martin pressed his attack despite seeing his squadron mates shot down, maintaining his course toward the optimal release point. At 800 yards range, Martin released his Mark 13 torpedo and pulled up sharply to clear Shokaku's superstructure. The torpedo ran true, striking the carrier on her port side below the waterline. The explosion opened a massive hole in the hull, flooding multiple compartments and causing the carrier to develop a noticeable list. Additional torpedoes from Martin's squadron struck Shokaku amidships and aft, overwhelming damage control capabilities and ensuring that the carrier was doomed. The veteran carrier that had participated in every major Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor was now dead in the water, abandoned by her crew as fires spread and flooding increased. Commander Howard Caldwell led dive bombers from USS Yorktown against carrier Shokaku, another Pearl Harbor veteran that had survived multiple battles only to face destruction in the Philippine Sea. Caldwell's attack achieved devastating accuracy with 3 direct hits that left Shokaku burning and unable to maintain speed. The carrier's captain ordered the crew to abandon ship as it became apparent that damage control efforts could not save her. Japanese destroyers moved alongside to rescue survivors, but American fighters strafed these rescue operations, inflicting additional casualties on men struggling in the water. The brutal reality of modern naval warfare left little room for humanitarian gestures when tactical advantage demanded maximum destruction of enemy forces. The attack on carrier Chiyoda demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of coordinated strikes by multiple aircraft types. Fighters swept the sky clear of Japanese defensive patrols while dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked simultaneously from different directions. The carrier's anti-aircraft gunners could not engage all threats effectively, and bombs and torpedoes overwhelmed her defenses within minutes. Chiyoda capsized and sank rapidly, taking most of her crew with her. The speed with which modern carriers could transition from operational effectiveness to total destruction reflected the vulnerability of these massive vessels to concentrated air attack. Admiral Ozawa watched the destruction of his carrier force from the bridge of cruiser Haguro after transferring his flag from the damaged Taiho. The systematic annihilation of Japanese naval aviation over the past 12 hours represented a disaster of strategic proportions. For fleet carriers sunk or sinking, 2 carriers heavily damaged, and approximately 400 aircraft destroyed along with most of their irreplaceable pilots. The naval air force that Japan had spent years building and that had dominated the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 had been effectively eliminated in a single day of combat. Ozawa understood that Japan could not replace these losses in any meaningful time frame. The industrial capacity that American forces possessed allowed them to absorb losses and return to combat strength within months, while Japanese shipyards and training programs could not keep pace with the attrition rate their forces were experiencing. The human dimension of the carrier battle manifested most tragically in the aftermath as surviving Japanese pilots attempted to return to carriers that no longer existed. Several aircraft circled over empty ocean where their ships had been steaming hours before, their fuel gauges reading empty and their options reduced to ditching in the open sea or attempting to reach distant Japanese bases. Many pilots chose to remain with their aircraft until fuel exhaustion forced them down, preferring death to the shame of capture. The cultural values that emphasized honor and self-sacrifice over survival created additional tragedy as capable pilots who might have contributed to future operations instead chose death in accordance with Bushido traditions. American pilots faced their own survival challenges as they turned eastward toward their carriers with fuel gauges registering dangerously low levels. The extended range of the strike meant that many aircraft would not have sufficient fuel to reach Task Force 58, forcing pilots to ditch in the ocean and hope for rescue by submarines or destroyers. Lieutenant Junior Grade Warren O. Marc of Bombing Squadron 2 watched his fuel gauge drop to 0 while still 90 miles from his carrier. He transmitted his position and prepared for a water landing, skillfully bringing his Helldiver down in a controlled ditching that allowed him and his gunner to escape before the aircraft sank. Marc and hundreds of other American aviators spent hours in life rafts awaiting rescue, their survival dependent on the extensive search and rescue operations that American forces routinely conducted. Admiral Mitscher made the controversial decision to order all Task Force 58 carriers to illuminate their flight decks despite the risk of revealing their positions to Japanese submarines. The gesture reflected Mitscher's commitment to recovering as many pilots as possible even if it meant accepting additional tactical risk. Carriers turned on every available light, creating a constellation of illumination that allowed exhausted pilots to find their way home in the darkness. The sight of those lights burning against the night sky became one of the most enduring memories for American naval aviators who participated in the Philippine Sea battle. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.